Now I'm going to explain how we continue getting energy out of our food. Before we explained the biochemical pathway glycolysis, which is the first step of cellular respiration. That's where energy from glucose is used to produce some ATP, some NADH, and then the end products are 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, now what we're going to do is explain what happens to this pyruvic acid. And it really depends on if there's oxygen in the cells or not. Now, let's first explain what happens if there's no oxygen, or not enough oxygen. In that case, pyruvate is converted into a different acid called lactic acid, or lactate. Okay. This happens in animal cells, like you and I. The reason really for doing this, it doesn't solve the problem. The acid's still there. It's in fact, lactic acid is the acid that builds up in muscles when you exercise really hard. If you've gone running and your muscle cells have run out of oxygen, they start building up this lactic acid, and as an acid, it denatures proteins, makes your muscles not function correctly. That's why you feel stiff and sore the next morning after a big race or a big workout. But the reason that the cells do this is that they need to have a supply of NAD. If the cells run out of NAD, there's no more NAD molecules floating around in the cytoplasm, then they can't build NADH. If that can't happen, then you can't make pyruvate. If that can't happen, then the whole process of glycolysis stops, and glucose doesn't break down at all, and so no ATP energy is produced, and the cells are going to die from lack of energy. So what happens instead is NADH molecules are used to combine with pyruvate, and that's going to be able to recycle around, continue doing its job in glycolysis. So it seems kind of pointless to build the NADH molecules with more energy just to turn around and use them up again, but it does solve the problem of keeping the NAD recycled so that ATP can continue being produced. That's what happens in animal cells. Other organisms are different. For example, in yeast cells, they take the pyruvate and convert it to ethanol, or another term for that is ethyl alcohol. Again, this happens in yeast cells. Okay. To do that, the energy from NADH is combined with the pyruvic acid, remakes the NAD, which is now recycled, and goes back up to glycolysis to continue that pathway. And also, some carbon dioxide is released as a waste product. And this process occurs naturally. Like thousands of years ago, people picked grapes and squashed them up in little buckets, and if it was deep enough and oxygen couldn't get to the bottom, then they'd start to ferment. In fact, these biochemical pathways that don't use oxygen, okay, from turning pyruvate into these other chemicals, are called fermentation reactions. And they don't use any oxygen. So sometimes they're referred to as anaerobic fermentation, meaning without air. And you could be more specific, like in animals you'd call it lactic acid fermentation, and in yeast it would be alcoholic fermentation. But as any general group, any of these reactions could be referred to as anaerobic fermentation. Now, other organisms, for example some bacteria, they can take the ethanol or the pyruvic acid and turn them into even other chemicals. For example, bacteria can produce acetic acid, which is vinegar. Or they can convert these chemicals into acetone, which is paint thinner. You girls might use it, fingernail polish remover. Or dozens, maybe even hundreds of other chemicals can be produced by bacteria in these anaerobic fermentation pathways. So they're very important. They happen all the time, but it's not the best way for cells to obtain a lot of energy. In fact, very few organisms on Earth can even survive by just doing fermentation. There's a few types of bacteria that do it, but all eukaryote organisms need to be able to get more energy out, or there's just not enough to keep our cells functioning. So that'll be the next thing we discuss, is how do we actually get more energy out of this pyruvate.